Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall, and this week's guest is a scientist who has been looking at evidence for the existence of life on Mars. Since Galileo first developed his telescope in 1608 and was first to observe Mars through it, astronomers have wondered about the possibility of life on the red planet. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get him beamed up onto the ship. Anthony Beckett.
Hi Richard, how are you
Welcome Anthony.
Thank you.
Are you okay?
Very well, thanks, yeah.
Good. So we're here to talk about Mars
Yes,
and your passion, I guess.
it's become that, yeah.
Now, how did you first get interested in Mars? Because I know you have a scientific background, you've got degrees in chemistry. How did that lead to an interest in Mars?
Well, I've always been following the space programs, and around 2004, I went to a conference and I saw a guy called Richard Hoagland give a presentation about evidence of artificial structures on Mars. And I came home from, this is 2004, 6 years ago, I came home and I just started studying and looking into this thing.
Right.
And what I found with it, there was very compelling evidence that there was something about this data, but I found it was quite difficult information to present to people, so I took it upon myself to start to do that myself, to put together the information in a digestible form that people could relate to.
So it was Hoagland that first got you involved.
Yeah, he got me hooked.
He's certainly a character, isn't he?
He is.
Now, there's been interest in Mars for centuries, hasn't there? And it sort of became more scientific in the 50s. But tell us about telescopes and people's interest in general over the centuries.
The telescope was invented in the 1600s, and it was, we don't really know who invented the telescope. It was invented by a Dutchman, apparently, of all accounts. A Dutchman applied for a patent, but it was refused because he hadn't actually invented it, because it had been widely known. The technology worked its way to Italy and to Venice, and Galileo basically started producing them for the market, started selling them. And it was actually in the same year of 1608 that Galileo first reported that he'd actually looked at Mars through the telescope, and that began the first real exploration of Mars. And as the years went by, even Cassini and all the kind of famous astronomers would have looked at Mars, Cassini, Huygens, and it got to towards like the middle of the 18th century. The telescopes were significantly advanced, that you could see kind of more detail. They'd also started using one of Newton's ideas, which is spectroscopy, to work out what the chemical composition of the Mars's atmosphere was. So by the middle of the 19th century, they'd already deduced that it had an atmosphere, that it was similar in some regards to the Earth, and that it possibly contained water vapour. There's debate about the accuracy of the scientific method at that time, so it wasn't, people argued the case. But what happened was in the opposition of 1977, opposition is when the Earth and Mars get to the closest point. It happens approximately every 2 years. And in 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was an astronomer based in Italy, looked at Mars through his telescope, one of his high-powered telescopes at the time, and started detailing lots of the features of
right. And what year are you talking about here?
This is 1877.
1877, and we've got an image there. Is that one of his images?
Yeah, this image is one of his maps. They called them Schiaparelli's maps, and people had drawn diagrams before, but Schiaparelli made a really detailed documentation of what he saw on the planet's surface. And it's basically one of the most noteworthy features is basically these long linear lines that kind of intersect and cross over the planes, the lighter planes. You can see there's actually darker regions and light regions, and these lines intersect over the light regions. Schiaparelli was an Italian. He referred to these as canali, because that's the Italian word which means channel. It was mistranslated into the English word canal.
Right.
And so, which obviously has connotations because it means it's synthetic, somebody's built it, it's not a natural form. And so what you had by the end of the 19th century, you had astronomers such as Percival Lovell, an American businessman and entrepreneur, I guess. He built the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff. It was the first time an observatory had been built dedicated to, well, in a certain location which had optimum viewing conditions, so you could see more information. And Lowell basically looked at he looked through on telescope at Mars. He saw the same canals as he recalled them, which were actually just channels by Schiaparelli's reckoning. And he basically created a mythology about the existence of Martian beings living on basically this world, and who were using these channels to transport water from the polar regions, which he considered to have water, down to the desert regions, which he considered to be dry. So basically, Percival Lovell created, well, he wasn't the first person to postulate the idea of Martian beings, but he really kind of promoted the idea in the popular culture of the time.
Okay, and what are these channels or these lines? I mean, do we know what they are now?
In fact, we don't really know what they are to this day, because once we got there in the first mission, which is Martian 9, there was no channels, canali to be seen.
Okay.
So we're not really sure what they were looking at.
Right.
It's been speculated. Well, there was a scientist from about 1920s whose name I forget, but he speculated that what these channels was actually the radial impact debris fields. So imagine like a meteorite hits, you get radial patterns out. So there's something. What he was saying was that the dark spots between the canals were impact craters. Obviously, from Earth-based telescopes in the 19th century, they're not going to see that detail. Right. But we never really worked out, because the coloration of the surface seems to have been different when we got there in the 60s and
we'll
70s.
come on to colours later on in the programme.
Yeah.
Now, you know, as the 1950s approached, we entered the space race, and serious scientists started thinking there could be life on this planet. So I believe there are certain institutes which sort of considered the possibility that there might be intelligent life even on Mars.
Well, yeah, well, NASA itself commissioned the Brookings Institute to look into it actually commissioned it to look into the peaceful. It's a study into the peaceful space exploration, but part of that was basically trying to consider what would happen if we discovered such things as intelligent beings outside of the solar system and outside of planet Earth. Sorry. The
Brookings Institute, was this sort of philosophers of the day, or what sort of people were involved in that?
Well, it was a think tank. It's basically a Washington, D.C. based think tank that was basically, they'll do commissions, they'll do reports into all sorts of different things. And basically, NASA was founded in about 1958 or 59. At the same time, it's around the same year NASA commissioned this report, because they knew the Soviets had got some man in orbit. Sputnik had been the first artificial satellite, and the Americans were a little bit far behind. So they needed to really get their act together to get on target in the space race. So the Brookings report was basically them giving them an overview of how they would proceed and conduct their space activities peacefully.
So they weren't really a technical body. They were more of like looking at the morality of it and the impact on humanity.
Oh, yeah, and the economic impact as well.
Yeah, and I believe we've got a quote here from the Brookings Institute, Anthony.
Yeah, I'll just read this short section out. It goes, though intelligent or semi-intelligent life conceivably exists elsewhere in the solar system, if intelligent extraterrestrial life is discovered in the next 20 years, it will very probably be by radio telescope from other solar systems. However, evidence of its existence might also be found in artifacts left on the Moon or other planets. So what NASA's the think tank came up with the conclusion was that if extraterrestrial life exists and it's out there, then we might start seeing the remnants of that when we start exploring into the solar system. And that was the whole reason for NASA commissioning it. The report itself covered all sorts of things like the advances in weather forecasting technology, so they could see they knew that they could actually work out to see. Back in the days, they had like a few hours warning for a hurricane coming over Florida, for example. It gave them the opportunity to realise that they could develop weather systems and things, all sorts of different things. But this was only minor. So this part about the intelligent life was only a minor part of the report, but it might as well be a significant one.
Right, well, we'll come on to the possibility of ruins and other such things later on. But I've got a list here, Anthony, which is, I didn't realise there's been so many probes actually gone to Mars or attempted to go to Mars. I mean, you've got a list here which goes right back to 1960. And it's interesting that the first sort of 5 missions were all Russian up to 1962, and every single one of them failed. Then we've got Mariner 3, which is the first US one, which failed. And then the first successful one was Mariner 4 in 1964, and that returned just 21 images.
Yeah. It was a flyby. The Mariner 4 mission was a flyby. It didn't go into orbit, and it only took a limited number of pictures. So the 21 images are simply because it was it was passing Mars, and it just shot the video cameras to see what it could see. And to be frank, it kind of was kind of disappointing, because prior to that mission, it was widely even scientists seriously considered that there might well be, like, higher forms of life on Mars, such as trees and things. And in the early days of NASA, they were actually considering how they would actually detect life on other planets and this kind of thing. And they actually considered that when looking for life on Mars, they might even see evidence of plant life in videos shot of the planet. Unfortunately, Mariner was being of the day and the technology of the day. It was black and white video. It wasn't very high resolution. It basically wasn't going to show evidence of life. But the disappointing part of this was that it showed evidence of heavy cratering on Mars, which basically made the planet look very much more like the Moon, which we know to be lifeless.
Right.
So it was disappointing in that respect because it dashed the hopes of many who thought there might be life on Mars.
Right, with just 21 images.
Yeah.
And if we look, I mean, there's more than 40 probes actually gone to Mars over the years, and they're nearly all either American or Russian. And out of the 40-odd, there's only 17, give or take one or two. I've just done an estimate here, 17 out of 41. So way more than half of the missions have actually failed that have gone to Mars. And the only other nations other than Russia and the US there was one in Japan, from Japan, 1998, which again failed. And then there was the famous Beagle 2, which was a European effort, which also failed.
Yeah, the Beagle 2 was shipped to, even though it was the European Space Agency mission, it relied heavily on NASA still. So I think the Mars Express was the European Space Agency orbiter that carried Beagle 2. But they relied heavily on NASA for things like telemetry.
Right. So it's the European part of it which built the craft which went to Mars, and Beagle was like piggybacked on it. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
And then did this craft enter orbit? The Mars Express, it entered orbit.
Express went into orbit, and I think it's still there, and I think it's still active actually.
Right. So that was a success then. But the Beagle, which was part of it, which was to go down onto the surface.
It was supposed to be a lander to land on the surface and gather. In fact, it was. They've been to Mars. There's been a previous mission to Mars looking for life, but the Beagle 2 experiment had experiments on it that were suitably tailored towards basically proving once and for all whether there is life on the surface. Actually, we'll get onto the Viking missions later.
We'll come on to that.
But unfortunately, like you're alluding to, the mission it was a failure and it didn't succeed. The claim was that the parachute deployment didn't work successfully or something, or didn't work adequately. There was actually speculation at the time from scientists involved that they misjudged the atmospheric conditions, which is why they basically didn't manage to get the probe down. And there was some criticism of NASA in that regard because they obviously maybe didn't help as much as they could do, having had their own successes in the past.
Right, so NASA perhaps didn't give them all of the information about the atmosphere or what have you. I felt pretty sorry for Colin Pillinger at the time. I remember he took a lot of stick. I mean, it is interesting that Russia and America are really the only two that have got anywhere near.
Yeah.
And there is theories that the two have colluded. I know there was the Cold War, but a lot of people say that they were colluding behind closed doors during the Cold War. And perhaps, here comes Europe, who's going to say, right, there's life on Mars.
Oh, right, you're saying, because you're saying there's a third entity coming in.
It's a third entity coming in that maybe, we don't want them to discover what's down there. I'm not saying that's what happened, but it's, the thing didn't actually get to Mars, and as soon as it's got released from its parent craft, they couldn't communicate with it, could they?
So if you look at the successes and failures in the past, it's unlikely to get a success every time. So, but there's a significant number of failures, as you've mentioned.
Yes.
I think, from memory, I think there's proportionally more failures for missions to Mars than for any other planet. But then that might well be because when they went there in the first place, it was early days of the space program, and therefore there were more failures. Or it might be that there's something else to do with Mars and to do with exploring Mars. It's more inherently difficult to do.
Yeah.
Even though it's such a close planet to Earth.
Yeah. And there was one in 1973 which Russia launched, which missed the planet and is now in orbit around the Sun.
I'm sure there are several of those.
And then this other one here, which was 1992, a US one, failure lost prior to Mars arrival.
That's the Mars Observer spacecraft.
Yes.
Yeah, that was... the official explanation was they simply lost the telemetry. Somebody accidentally unplugged the telemetry on a $1 billion spacecraft.
Yeah, they just suddenly lost communication.
Yeah. It's interesting because we'll go into this later, but the evidence for artificiality and artificial ruins, and like I mentioned earlier, Mars from Richard Hoagland came from images brought back from Viking, which is from like 20 years before then. And so what actually I had at the time was people lobbying Congress in the US to set mission priorities for Mars Observer, and they were basically slated. And one guy wrote a report, a peer review, which really criticised them heavily. 3 days after his report was published, the probe was missing, was lost.
This is when they lost the probe.
And that was 3 days before it was due to be inserted into orbit.
Okay, and that was so after this scientist had said we should be looking for ruins on Mars.
Yeah, that was Professor Stanley McDaniel, did a peer review of Richard Hoagland's and other researchers' work.
3 days later, the telemetry stops working. Right.
One of those things.
Yeah. Okay, then, Anthony. Well, we're going to talk about the colours after the break because there's some very suspicious data with regards to that, and also possible ruins on Mars. But we'll come back after this short break.